Neri stared at her arm, transfixed by the display. "I've never seen these colors before," she said softly. Professor Kim paused, looking more closely at her reaction. "Interesting," he murmured. "Your species' photosynthetic properties seem to be resonating with certain compounds in human biochemistry. That's not documented in any research I've read." The rest of the class crowded forward, murmuring in surprise at the display. Neri quickly pulled her arm back, suddenly self-conscious about the attention. "Thank you for your assistance," Professor Kim said, his eyes meeting hers with unmistakable scientific curiosity. "Would you be willing to stay after class? I'd like to document this reaction. It may represent something new in cross-species aesthetic applications." Neri nodded, unable to look away from his gaze. For the first time, she found herself seeing beauty in a human face, not the symmetry or glow that her people prized, but something different, a spark of intelligence and wonder that transcended physical appearance. "Yes, Professor," she replied. "I'd like to learn more." Neri walked into the academy cafeteria, her skin still showing faint traces of the iridescent patterns from Professor Kim's demonstration yesterday. Several students turned to look at her as she entered, some with curiosity, others with barely concealed disapproval. "Look who's here," called Tahoe from a nearby table. His scale-like features glinted under the light as he gestured toward Neri, the human's new pet project. Neri ignored him, collecting her nutrient solution at the dispensary before looking for an empty seat. She had spent an extra hour after class with Professor Kim, allowing him to document the unusual reaction between his compounds and her photosynthetic skin. The experience had been both unsettling and exciting. "You can sit with us," offered Mina, a fellow Vermaxian with delicate crystalline structures that shimmered with subtle pink tones. Unlike many of their classmates, Mina had always shown interest in other species' beauty traditions. Neri slid onto the bench beside her friend. "Thanks." "So," Mina leaned closer, her voice dropping to a whisper, "is it true? Did your hair structures actually respond to human biochemistry?" Before Neri could answer, Tahoe appeared beside their table, flanked by two Bulgravian students whose exoskeletons were polished to a fashionable high sheen. "Humans are barely considered aesthetically functional by galactic standards," Tahoe said loudly enough for nearby tables to hear. "Why waste time studying their primitive concepts?" Neri kept her expression neutral. "Their techniques are different, creative in ways we haven't considered." "Different?" Tahoe let out a sharp laugh. "Our species represents the pinnacle of natural beauty in the galaxy. Our ancestors were creating living light sculptures while humans were still painting themselves with mud." Several students laughed, but Neri remained calm. "Professor Kim has combined techniques from 17 different species to create entirely new aesthetic approaches. That's hardly primitive." "You're just fascinated because he's exotic," one of the Bulgravians said, clicking her mandibles in amusement. "Everyone knows Vermaxians have a weakness for novelty." Neri stood up, gathering her things. "I'm interested in his work because it's innovative. Maybe if you paid attention in class instead of polishing your exoskeletons, you'd learn something too." She walked away, hearing Tahoe's mocking voice behind her. "She's obsessed with the human." Later that afternoon, Neri arrived early for Professor Kim's class, hoping to ask questions about the compound they had tested. To her surprise, he was already there, examining a series of three-dimensional images that floated above his desk. "Ah, Neri," he said, looking up with a smile. "I was hoping you'd come early. I've been analyzing yesterday's results." He gestured toward the images, which Neri now recognized as microscopic views of her skin cells. "The reaction was even more significant than I initially thought. Your cellular structures actually formed temporary bonds with the human-derived compounds." Neri moved closer to examine the images. "Is that unusual?" "Very. Most species' biological systems remain distinctly separate when exposed to foreign compounds. This suggests a previously undocumented compatibility between human and Vermaxian biochemistry." Before Neri could respond, the classroom door slid open. Director Park entered, her thin frame radiating authority despite her small stature. As head of the Academy's Aesthetic Studies Department, her opinion carried enormous weight. "Professor Kim," Director Park said coolly, "I need to speak with you and student Nari immediately." Professor Kim straightened. "Of course, Director. Is there a problem?" "My office, please." She turned and left without waiting for a response. 20 minutes later, Nari stood before Director Park's desk, trying not to let her anxiety show in her bioluminescent patterns. Professor Kim stood beside her, his expression calm but alert. "Student Nari," Director Park began, "a concern has been raised about your unusual interest in human aesthetic practices." "A concern?" Nari asked, confused. "Yes. Several students have reported what they perceive as an inappropriate level of attention directed toward Professor Kim and his teachings." Nari felt her skin dim with embarrassment. "Director, I'm simply interested in cross-species applications. Student Tahoe has formally requested that you be reassigned to a different class," Director Park continued. "He believes your focus on human aesthetics is undermining the cultural heritage of our species." Professor Kim stepped forward. "With respect, Director, Nari is one of my most promising students. Her willingness to explore unfamiliar techniques shows exactly the kind of innovative thinking the Academy claims to promote." "Perhaps," Director Park said, studying Nari carefully. "But you must understand the delicacy of the situation. The Vermaxian Cultural Council provides significant funding to this academy. They expect their students to become masters of traditional Vermaxian beauty arts, not experimenters with human techniques." Nari stood tall despite her nervousness. "Director Park, isn't true beauty about discovering harmony across differences? Professor Kim's techniques bridge species boundaries in ways we've never attempted." Director Park's expression remained unreadable. "Your enthusiasm is noted, Student Nari. However, I expect you to demonstrate equal devotion to traditional Vermaxian practices in your upcoming assessments." She turned to Professor Kim. "And I would advise you, Professor, to remember that you are here to supplement our teaching, not to convert our students to human aesthetic philosophies." After they were dismissed, Nari and Professor Kim walked slowly down the corridor. "I'm sorry," Nari said quietly. "I didn't mean to cause trouble." Professor Kim shook his head. "You have nothing to apologize for. Cultural barriers exist throughout the galaxy, Nari. Breaking them down is rarely comfortable." He paused, looking at her thoughtfully. "But it's always worthwhile." The lecture hall buzzed with nervous energy as students checked and double-checked their notes. Today, Professor Kim would announce the final project that would determine half their grade for the semester. For Nari, this project represented more than just academic success. It was a chance to prove that her interest in human aesthetic techniques had genuine scientific merit. Professor Kim entered the room with his usual measured stride, setting his materials on the desk before looking out at the class. "Your final project," he began without preamble, "will challenge you to create something truly universal. You must develop an aesthetic treatment that works effectively across multiple species while respecting the biological uniqueness of each." Excited murmurs spread through the room. Cross-species applications were usually theoretical exercises, not practical assignments. "You will work in pairs," Professor Kim continued, "with species as different from your own as possible." Nari's heart sank. After the meeting with Director Park, most students had kept their distance from her. Who would want to pair with the Vermaxian, who was obsessed with humans? As students began to pair up, Nari remained at her desk, trying to appear unconcerned. Tahoe smirked in her direction as he partnered with a popular Centaurian student. "Still alone, Nari?" Professor Kim's voice startled her. He had approached her desk without her noticing. "It seems we have an odd number of students today. Would you be willing to work independently?" Nari nodded quickly. "Yes, Professor." "Good. I'll expect more from a solo project," he said, his expression giving nothing away. "Your regular check-ins will be during my office hours." Later that evening, Nari sat in her small dormitory room, surrounded by holographic research displays. She had spent hours researching potential cross-species treatments, but nothing seemed innovative enough. Everything had been tried before. She absent-mindedly touched her skin where Professor Kim's compound had created those unusual patterns weeks ago. The reaction had faded, but the memory remained vivid. What if she could develop a treatment that enhanced the natural bioluminescence in Vermaxian skin while also working on human skin? Humans didn't have natural bioluminescence, of course, but what if they had potential for it that had never been detected? For the next 2 weeks, Nari worked tirelessly in the Academy's laboratory, often staying long after other students had left. She carefully extracted compounds from her own bioluminescent skin cells, modifying them to be compatible with human biology. Her research indicated that certain dormant genes in human skin cells might respond to Vermaxian compounds if properly modified. One evening, as she was testing yet another formulation, a voice broke her concentration. "Testing on yourself again." Nari jumped, nearly dropping the sample she was holding. Professor Kim stood beside her workstation, observing her work with interest. "Professor, I didn't hear you come in." "Most students left hours ago," he replied, gesturing toward the time display that showed it was well past midnight. "Your dedication is impressive. May I see your progress?" Nari hesitated, suddenly self-conscious about her work. "It's still very experimental. The formulation needs Vermaxian compounds, but I can't test the effects on human physiology without a human subject." Professor Kim studied her notes and the sample in her hand. After a moment's consideration, he rolled up his sleeve, exposing his forearm. "Used me as your test subject." Nari stared at him in shock. That's not protocol. The compound hasn't been properly tested yet." "Innovation rarely follows protocol," he replied with a slight smile. "Your theoretical framework is sound, and your safety precautions are adequate. A small test area should pose minimal risk." Heart racing, Nari carefully applied a tiny amount of her compound to Professor Kim's skin. For several moments, nothing happened. Then, gradually, a subtle glow began to emanate from the test area, faint but unmistakable. "It's working," Nari whispered in disbelief. Even more surprisingly, the glow pulsed in a pattern that matched the natural rhythm of Nari's own bioluminescence. As they watched in amazement, the pattern on Professor Kim's arm began to synchronize perfectly with Nari's skin. "This is unprecedented," Professor Kim said quietly, his scientific detachment momentarily giving way to wonder. "Human skin has never demonstrated bioluminescent properties before. It's responding to my presence," Nari realized. "The compound is creating a bridge between our biological systems." Professor Kim carefully documented the reaction with his recording device. "Your project has gone beyond aesthetics, Nari. This could have significant implications for interspecies medicine and communication." They worked together for several more hours, testing different concentrations and application methods. The compound's effects lasted approximately 30 minutes before fading without any apparent side effects. As they were cleaning up the lab, Professor Kim paused. "Why did you choose this particular approach for your project? There were simpler options that would have satisfied the assignment requirements." Nari considered her answer carefully. "I wanted to find something that would truly unite different species, not just work on them separately, but create a connection between them. After our first demonstration, when my skin reacted to your touch, I wondered if there was something more there to discover." Professor Kim nodded thoughtfully. "That's the essence of scientific curiosity, seeing an unexpected reaction and asking why instead of dismissing it as an anomaly." He gathered his things to leave, then turned back to her. "Be prepared, Nari. What you've discovered here may attract more attention than you anticipated. Not everyone will appreciate its significance." Nari looked at her notes and samples, suddenly aware that her simple class project had become something much more important. "I understand, Professor," she said, though she wasn't sure she did, not completely. But she would soon find out. The day of the final project presentations arrived. The Academy had invited several distinguished guests, including members of the Galactic Science Council, to observe the students' work. Nari checked her presentation materials nervously, aware that her project had evolved far beyond the original assignment. Would the Academy officials view her discovery as a breakthrough or as an inappropriate deviation from traditional Vermaxian studies? Professor Kim had helped her prepare a controlled demonstration of the compound's effects. They had documented every stage of the research with meticulous care, building a scientific case that would be difficult to dismiss. Remember, Professor Kim had told her during their final preparation session, focus on the scientific implications, not just the aesthetic applications. Nari waited as other students presented their projects. Most had created variations on established techniques, color enhancements for scale-bearing species, crystalline polishes for silicon-based life forms, or temporary texture modifications for various skin types. The judges nodded politely but seemed unimpressed. When Tahoe demonstrated his project, a traditional Vermaxian light pattern enhancer with minimal modifications for other species, he received appreciative murmurs from the Vermaxian Cultural Council representatives. Now, announced Director Park, we will hear from student Nari, who has worked independently on her project. Nari stepped forward, her skin glowing softly with the natural patterns of nervousness. She activated her display screens, showing the molecular structure of her compound. My project began as an aesthetic enhancement for photosynthetic skin species, she explained, but evolved into something more significant. I discovered that when properly formulated, certain Vermaxian bioluminescent compounds can activate dormant cellular properties in human skin. Murmurs spread through the audience. One of the Galactic Science Council members leaned forward with sudden interest. With Professor Kim's permission, I will demonstrate the effects. Nari continued. She applied a small amount of her compound to Professor Kim's forearm. The audience watched in silence as his skin began to glow softly, the patterns matching and responding to Nari's own bioluminescence. The effect was subtle but unmistakable. As you can see, Nari explained, the compound creates a temporary biofeedback loop between Vermaxian and human biology. This suggests humans possess latent bioluminescent capabilities that have never been detected before. The Science Council representative, a tall Arcturian with feathered sensors around her head, stood up. This has implications beyond aesthetics. Have you tested the compound's potential for medical applications? Before Nari could answer, a commotion at the back of the hall drew everyone's attention. Two figures in dark clothing pushed their way through the doors. They moved with unnatural speed, heading directly toward Nari and her display. Security breach, shouted Director Park, reaching for the emergency alert system. One of the intruders pulled out a device that emitted a high-pitched sound, temporarily disorienting everyone nearby. The other grabbed for Nari's research samples displayed on the table. Stop them. They're trying to steal the research, someone shouted. Without hesitation, Professor Kim moved between the intruders and Nari. Despite being physically smaller than the attackers, he showed no fear. Professor, be careful, Nari called out, but it was too late. The larger intruder swung at him with a powerful arm. To everyone's surprise, Professor Kim sidestepped the attack with unexpected agility. In one smooth motion, he grabbed a container of cleaning solution from a nearby table and sprayed it directly into the attacker's visual sensors. The intruder howled in pain, stumbling backward. The second intruder lunged forward, but Professor Kim had already grabbed Nari's demonstration materials. He quickly mixed two chemicals, creating a reaction that filled the area with dense, harmless smoke. Confusion spread through the room as visibility dropped to zero. Nari felt Professor Kim's hand on her arm, pulling her down behind a display table. "Stay here," he whispered. "Security is coming." Through the smoke, Nari could hear sounds of struggle. When the Academy's security forces finally cleared the air, they found both intruders subdued, one by the security team, and, surprisingly, one by Professor Kim himself. "How did you?" Nari began, staring at the professor in amazement. "Humans may lack natural defenses," he explained calmly, "but we compensate with resourcefulness. Basic chemistry and quick thinking can be quite effective. As the intruders were taken away, the Galactic Science Council representative approached Nari and Professor Kim. "Those individuals work for Nexus Biologics," she said grimly, "a corporation known for stealing and exploiting new biological technologies." She turned to Nari. "Your discovery is far more valuable than you realize, young one. The ability to create temporary biological connections between different species could revolutionize interspecies medicine." Director Park joined them, her expression a mix of concern and newfound respect. "Student Nari, it seems your unconventional approach has yielded unexpected results." The Arcturian Council member nodded. "We would like to offer official Galactic Science Council protection for your research, with the possibility of a grant to continue your work." Nari looked at Professor Kim, who gave her an encouraging nod. "It's your discovery, Nari," he said. "You should decide how to proceed." Nari took a deep breath. "I would be honored to accept the Council's protection, but I want Professor Kim to continue as my research partner. This discovery belongs to both of us." The Arcturian's feathered sensors rippled with approval. "Of course. In fact, this collaboration between a Vermaxian and a human gives us reason to reevaluate humanity's scientific classification within the galactic community." Director Park cleared her throat. "It seems I owe you both an apology. Sometimes traditional perspectives need to be challenged for true advancement to occur." As the excitement continued around them, Nari turned to Professor Kim. "You saved me and the research, but you could have been seriously hurt." Professor Kim smiled slightly. "Humans have always been underestimated in the galactic community. Sometimes that works to our advantage." For the first time, Nari truly understood. Humans weren't just aesthetically interesting or academically clever. They possessed a unique adaptive capability that her species, for all its natural beauty, lacked completely. The grand atrium of the Galactic Cultural Academy shimmered with decorative light patterns as students from hundreds of worlds gathered for graduation day. Nari stood at the edge of the crowd, her crystalline hair structures catching and reflecting the celebratory lights around her. 3 months had passed since the attempted theft of her research, and those months had changed everything. She spotted Tahoe across the room, surrounded by his usual group of admirers. To her surprise, he nodded slightly in her direction, not quite friendly, but no longer openly hostile. News of her discovery had spread throughout the academy and beyond, forcing even her critics to acknowledge its importance. "Nervous about your speech?" asked a familiar voice behind her. Nari turned to see Professor Kim approaching, dressed in formal Earth attire that somehow complemented the crystalline decorations of the academy. "A little," she admitted. "I never expected to be selected as graduating speaker." "Your work earned it," Professor Kim replied. "The Academy Board couldn't ignore the fact that your research has been cited in 17 scientific journals in the past month alone." Nari's skin glowed with modest pride. What had begun as a simple beauty treatment had evolved into a groundbreaking medical technique. The compound she and Professor Kim had refined could now create temporary biological connections between nearly any two species, allowing for unprecedented advances in cross-species medical treatments. "The Galactic Science Council has approved our joint research program," Professor Kim said, lowering his voice. "They granted unprecedented status to human biologists because of your discovery." "Our research?" Nari asked, surprised. "If you're interested, they've allocated a full laboratory and research team at the Central Galactic Research Facility." Before Nari could respond, Director Park approached them, her expression more respectful than it had been during their confrontation months earlier. "It's time for the ceremony to begin," she said. "Professor Kim, the council representatives would like you seated with them on the main platform." As Professor Kim moved away, Director Park lingered. "Student Nari, I wish to express my personal gratitude for your contribution to the Academy's reputation. Your research has brought us considerable prestige." "Thank you, Director," Nari replied, still somewhat surprised by the change in the administrator's attitude. I understand you have received offers from the Vermaxian Cultural Institute to continue traditional beauty studies. Director Park continued. A prestigious opportunity. Nari nodded. The offer had arrived last week, a position that would have been her dream before meeting Professor Kim. Now she wasn't so sure. Whatever path you choose, Director Park said, know that it has been my privilege to witness your growth here. The ceremony began with speeches from various officials. Nari barely listened, her mind turning over the choice before her. Return to Vermax to pursue traditional beauty arts, or join Professor Kim's research team, exploring the new frontier they had discovered together. When it was her turn to speak, Nari approached the podium with steady steps, looking out at the diverse faces of her fellow graduates. When I arrived at this academy, she began, I believe my people represented the pinnacle of evolutionary beauty. Our crystalline structures and natural bioluminescence were considered superior by many galactic standards. She paused, her gaze finding Professor Kim in the audience. But true beauty isn't about perfection in isolation. It's about how different forms can complement and enhance each other. My research began with a simple question. Could the aesthetic traditions of one species benefit another? What I discovered was something much more profound, that beneath our obvious differences, our biology shares fundamental patterns waiting to be connected. As she spoke, Nari activated a small amount of the compound on her hand. It began to glow with patterns that rippled across her skin. This compound does more than create beautiful patterns. It reveals connections that have always existed but remained hidden. It reminds us that the boundaries between species are more permeable than we imagined. She touched her crystalline hair structures, which now occasionally pulsed in patterns similar to human biorhythms, a permanent effect of her extended exposure to the compound. I carry within me now a small part of another species' patterns. It hasn't made me less Vermaxian. It has expanded my understanding of what I can be. After the ceremony, Professor Kim found Nari among the celebrating graduates. That was an excellent speech, he said. Have you made your decision about the research position? Nari looked around at the academy that had been her home for 3 years. I have. I want to continue our work together. There's so much more to discover. Professor Kim nodded, a rare full smile crossing his face. I had hoped you would say that. The Vermaxian Cultural Institute won't be pleased, Nari said. They expected me to return and teach traditional techniques. Traditional and innovative approaches can coexist, Professor Kim replied. In fact, I've been considering establishing a cultural exchange program between Earth and Vermax, with regular workshops for students from both worlds. We would need a co-director, of course. Nari's skin brightened with excitement. That's perfect. We could share knowledge in both directions. As they walked together through the graduation festivities, Nari noticed how students from different species were mingling more freely than they had at the beginning of the year. Her research had done more than advance science. It had begun to change perspectives. You know what humans' greatest strength is? Professor Kim asked, observing the same scene. Your resourcefulness, Nari suggested, remembering how he had handled the research thieves. That helps, he acknowledged. But I think our greatest strength is our ability to see beauty in diversity. Throughout our history, the moments of our greatest advancement came when different cultures and ideas connected. Nari touched the graduation medal hanging around her neck. Perhaps that's not just a human strength. Perhaps it's the future for all of us.